Hey there, it's me Eden. If you are new to the channel, then please subscribe to my channel and visit my Patreon page for early access, link in the description. Gradually more guests began to arrive, my grandmother, a couple of aunts, cousins, friends and neighbors. Eventually Dad arrived with Uncle Frank, both looking as if they had already sank a few too many, sober enough however for the party to get into full swing. We mixed and mingled with the other guests, introducing ourselves as George and Amanda, everything as normal, each one accepting us for what we were. As the music kicked in and the dancing began, I excused myself from George for a minute and went to find a quiet spot to have a cigarette. I slipped round the side of the house onto the paved path and took out my cigarettes. Lighting one up, I blew a cloud of smoke into the air. I'd only been there a couple of minutes when a voice said, "Can I bum one of those?" I turned. "Ashley," I said. "Hello bruv, or should I say sis, what the hell have you got yourself into?" I handed Ash the pack and the lighter. "Long story, but necessary," I answered. She lit up. "Well, you certainly look the part, but where is this going?" "What do you mean?" "Well, it needs to end sometime and there will be tears somewhere," she said, taking a long drag from the cigarette. She blew a stream of smoke to the floor. "Maybe. Do you think anyone has noticed anything?" I asked. "No, in fact couple of people I've been taking to has said how pleased they are for George and how lucky he is to have found a good-looking partner." "Good. I just had to be here, you know, and changing back to Alex for today would have been a nightmare just to change back again tomorrow." "Well, as long as you don't get hurt in all this, then I'm cool with it. Now let's get back to the party. Dad's about to make a speech." The night wore on, darkness fell, and the garden was illuminated by hundreds of little spotlights hung from all available points so that sufficient light was available. Once more I snuck up for a cigarette. This time when I was finished I skipped back inside to check on Melissa. I was glad to be away from the biz, have a few minutes on my own. For a start the wine was beginning to take an effect on me and I needed a few minutes to compose myself. I walked into the room where the kids had been corralled for the night with snacks and DVDs to keep them entertained. Inside were several relatives' children being watched over by one of the neighbors' teenage daughters. Grandmother was also there fussing around with one of my nephews. I knew her well and introduced myself as Amanda. We shook hands. She asked if I could stay for a minute while she nipped out for a drink. "Yeah, no problem," I said as she stepped through the door. My voice must have triggered Melissa and her head snapped round. "Ax," she said, rushing out off the couch and towards me, her arms encircling my legs. As I looked up I could see Grandma looking at me with suspicion. What is it they say about out of the mouths of children? I froze. Grandma looked sternly at me and walked across the room. She sort of paused, squinting slightly at my elegantly made-up face as I stroked Melissa's head. "There's something not quite right here. Your mum's been on edge all night." I stayed silent. "Well, my dear, what is it? You're supposed to be Amanda, are you not?" I sighed, looking down at Melissa, trying to think about how I was going to get out of this one. My mind was a blank. I guess then honesty will need to be the best policy. "Look, Grandma, I can explain." "I hope so," she replied. "Let's sit down for a minute," I said as I took Melissa's hand and led her towards the settee. 30 minutes later I had told my story. "So you see, it was for Melissa's sake. I made a silly mistake and I've had to live this lie since. George is not to blame. Me and Debbie badgered him into me coming as Amanda tonight. I just wanted to be here for Dad in some way." "And your mum knows about this?" I nodded. "And Ashley," I said, "but Dad has no idea. Please don't tell him," I pleaded. "Well, I don't really approve, but I've no wish to spoil his day, but this has to stop," she said, her finger wagging at me. "It will, Grandma, as soon as George is on his feet and thinking a bit clearer about Melissa," I answered. "You really think this woman is so bad for the child?" she asked. "Yeah, I do. She's no motherly instinct. She only wants George for the money," I said. "Well, okay, should I have a word with him?" she asked. No, don't do that, he will go mad if he knows that anyone else knows about this, I said, gesturing with my hands down at my dress. Okay, but remember it has to stop. The door opened and finally the babysitter stepped back inside. Sorry, my mum kept me back, she said, looking a bit sheepish as she returned to her duties. That's okay, it gave me a chance to meet Melissa's gran, I said, a slight smile on my lips. I could see her looking sternly at me as I rose. See you soon, Melissa, I said as I walked to the door. As I walked outside, I sighed a huge sigh of relief. I needed a cigarette. I slipped out, passing a few guests in the kitchen, smiling briefly, and walked round the corner of the house. Opening my bag, I took out my cigarettes and lit up. The smoke immediately hitting my brain, calming my nerves a bit. That was close. Let's hope she keeps to her word, I thought to myself. Somehow I felt she would, but I also knew that Mum would probably feel the sharp edge of her tongue at some point. A few minutes later, I stubbed out the cigarette with my shoe and walked back towards the party. I had been gone for nearly an hour, so I was keen to find George and see what was happening with him. I spotted him close to the small marquee talking to Ashley. Here's the love of your life, Ashley teased as I drew close. I flashed her a smile. Where have you been? George asked. I went to check on Melissa, got talking to the babysitter, I lied. I looked at his glass. What's that you're drinking? I asked. Just a whiskey, he replied. Just a whiskey, you idiot, how many of them have you had? Your dad kept giving me them. Oh, maybe 3 or 4, he replied. Yeah. And you had 2 cans of beer as well before I went away. You can't drive like that, I said, anger in my voice. Sure I can. No way am I letting you drive Melissa home when you've been drinking, I said. Well, we can't stay here, he said. We'll just have to, you idiot. I stormed off to find Mum. Mom was busy seeing some guests out. I waited a minute and then drew her attention. What is it? She asked. George has been drinking, he wants to drive, but I don't think he should. It's too much of a risk with Melissa and all that. Dad's been feeding him drink, I said at a frantic pace. You can't stay here. Ashley and Auntie Marge and Uncle Frank are using our spare rooms. Well, we can't go home either, I repeated. Okay, leave it with me, I'll come and find you. She left and I headed back to the party. There were only a smattering of guests left. As I walked across the grass, I opened my bag and took out my cigarettes, lighting one as I walked on. George, the first could see, was deep in conversation with Dad. To be honest, I'd sort of avoided Dad all night, but no, I was walking straight towards him. Here's you lovely wife-to-be, Dad said through a slurred, drunk voice. It was obvious he had taken a skinful tonight and was well and truly drunk. I stepped next to George. So Fen, is the big day? He asked. Oh, not for a while yet, George said. Good to see you putting your life back together, he managed to say. Why don't you give the lady a kiss? Don't be shy, he said. George looked at me, bent a little, and kissed my forehead. Nah, lad. Mean a real kiss, he persisted. George looked down. I slightly nodded and our heads moved together. Our lips met, my mouth opening slightly. We paused for a minute and then, when we thought that Dad would be happy, we parted. That's a bit better now. Go and take the lady up for a dance, he said. George looked at me. I nodded again. He lightly placed his hand on my waist. I dropped my cigarette and followed him on to the small dance floor. I can't dance, I said. Look, just put your arms around my neck and we will just shuffle around, he said. I put both arms around his neck, moved closer, and we started to move together. What did you Mum say? He asked. She's trying to sort out somewhere for us to stay. How could you be so daft? I said. I'm sorry, he said. It's okay, we've got past the worst of the night, and we have pulled it off, I said. Yeah. We have, I replied. Out of the corner of my eye I could see Mum exit the house and move towards us. Here's Mum coming, I said. We stopped dancing. "George, Amanda, Aunt Karen has got a spare room, you can stay there tonight," she said, "but you will need to share." Her eyebrows arched a bit. Dad pipped in, "That won't be a problem, after all they're going to be man and wife," he said in his drunken state. George looked at me and then said, "Thanks, do we need to get a taxi there?" he asked. "If you hurry, they are just getting ready to leave now. Melissa is fast asleep, you can pick her up from the lounge." "Okay, George, can you get the little bag I packed from the car and I'll go and get Melissa." "Okay, darling," he said, playing his part. I walked with a little smile on my lips at his comment. I picked up Melissa and found Aunt Karen by the door, her cost on ready to leave. "Sorry about this," I mumbled. "It's okay, could happen to anyone. Where's George?" she asked. Just picking up a small bag of clothes I packed for an emergency." "Good thinking, it pays to be well prepared," she said. George appeared carrying the whole doll just as a taxi pulled up outside. Aunt Karen was a widow whose husband had died in an accident at work a few years back. Both her son was studying at university, so I figured that we would get his room. We climbed into the taxi and drove off to make the short journey to her house. 5 minutes later we turned into her street and we stepped out. George insisted on paying the taxi driver. "It's the least we can do as you're offering us a room for the night," he said as we walked up the path. Inside, Aunt Karen made us some coffee. George sat with Melissa in the kitchen while we took our cup upstairs. "You can stay in my room tonight," she said. "No, we couldn't put you out like that," I argued. "Nonsense anyway, the bed in Shane's room is too small." She showed me the room and where the bathroom was. "So when are you two getting hitched?" she asked. "Oh, I don't know, we've not set a date yet." "George is quite a catch, you know," she said. "Yeah, he is, isn't he?" I said. "Can you ask him to come up? There's a camp bed in the attic, we can make it up for Melissa, if he helps me down with it," she said. "Okay, I'll go and get him." I left her and went back to the kitchen. Half an hour later the camp bed was up and we, Melissa, George and me, were in the room. Aunt Karen had headed off to bed. "Do you want me to sleep on the camp bed?" I asked quietly. "Melissa could bunk in with you." "What if Karen comes in the morning and we're in separate beds?" George said. I guess you're right." I put the dozing Melissa down on the covers and covered her over. "Good night, darling," I said, kissing her forehead. George did the same. We both crossed to the bed. George began to undress, his shoes and socks followed by his trousers. I tried not to look and turned, slipping my dress off. I unfastened the stockings and suspender belt that I was wearing and draped them over the chair. Standing in a light blue thong and matching undergarments, I slipped under the covers and pulled them up over me. A minute or so later I felt the bed sag and George slipped in beside me. "Good night," he said. "Yeah, good night, see you in the morning," I replied as he switched off the bedside light. Please subscribe my channel for the next part. And visit my Patreon page for early access.